Only a fighter knows what goes through the mind before a fight. The preparations, the rituals to mask the fear. Fear of these last moments of uncertainty before it's time to face the crowd. It's 1826 in Georgian England, and the fight is on. Now, new investigation is revealing the world of the duelists, who fought to the death with pistols on the field of honor.
A large number of dueling stories, for better or worse, involve drink.
They fought to clear their names, to settle a dispute, or simply to say they were right. And many were dead before breakfast.
Most of the shots fired during a pistol duel will hit you in the head, neck, or torso or upper limb.
Throughout history, men and women have faced one another in personal combat. At close quarters, one-on-one, face-to-face. They fought for honor, to settle bitter disputes, for prowess, to prove courage and skill, and for sport, to win glory and respect. From the pageantry of the medieval tournament ground, through the deadly rituals of duelists on the field of honor, to the savage backstreet arena of the bare-knuckle prize ring. It's these worlds that Fight Club explores. From 1714 to the 1830s, the Georgian period brought bloodshed on a scale never before seen. Across the world, British soldiers and sailors fought wars from North America to India. In Europe, they fought almost constantly, including nearly 25 years of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. These were violent times, and not just around the world. At home in England too, men, and some women, fought to the death to settle their differences. The image of two men marshalling their courage to face one another in a duel of honor captivates the imagination. Over the years, many artists, novelists, and filmmakers have used the duel as the ultimate form of civilized confrontation. Yet this romanticized view is a long way from the bloody truth.
Most people are not trained to kill. It's a very foreign feeling to most people, a very foreign procedure. To kill is unnatural. I think if you're looking at life 200 years ago, when nearly 10% of injuries were caused by farm animals and accidents, these men were inured to difficulty, but not many were inured to kill. And I'm sure that training in discipline in the armed services prepared you very well for this. That's why there'd be a big difference between somebody in a duel who was a good infantry officer and a civilian who'd had no training at all.
Throughout Georgian times in Britain, dueling claimed many hundreds and probably thousands of lives. From 1785 to the end of the Georgian period in the 1830s, there were at least 1,000 known duels. It's likely that many more were fought unknown, in secret. Author and historian Richard Hopton has researched the rise and development of dueling in Britain, through to its zenith in the Georgian period.
I'd always been fascinated by the fact that people would resolve arguments by shooting at each other or fighting with swords, rather than, as people do now, by apologising or by resort to law. Duelling evolved out of the medieval practices of jousting and trial by combat.
In Britain, in the late 18th and early 19th century, the most common form of duelling was fighting with pistols. Yet this hadn't always been the case. Duelling had first spread to England from Europe in the 16th century, and the preferred weapon of that age was the sword. Fighting with swords was potentially lethal, but it required a degree of skill, or at the very least, some training and experience. Yet there were new weapons on the way, and they were made possible by the great leveller, gunpowder. Through the 17th century, firearms technology rapidly improved, and the pistol gradually began to replace the sword as the weapon of choice for duelling. Gone were the months and even years required to master the art of the sword.
The change from duelling with swords to duelling with pistols really came about as a result of changes in dress, because gentlemen stopped wearing swords as a piece of everyday dress from about the middle of the 18th century onwards. So whilst the change in dueling weapons didn't happen overnight, it would be fair to say, I think, that before 1740, the vast majority of duels were fought with swords, whereas after, say, 1760, the vast majority of duels were fought with pistols, and it's from about 1760 that the art of making dueling pistols really took off.
Short-barreled pistols were the first personal handguns. Easier to use than the heavy long-arm musket, they were also easier to conceal and transport, which made them ideal for dueling.
Many holster pistols, of course, were military. They were, as the name would imply, held in as a pair in a pistol holster set over the horse's body, and you would have two to give you two shots, and you would draw one, and the sort of doctrine was to ride up to the enemy, point it right at his face or his chest and pull the trigger, because otherwise you'd probably miss.
By the late 17th and early 18th century, the dominant form of pistol in Britain was the flintlock.
The flintlock pistol was a personal sidearm, and this is the sort of thing that an officer or a gentleman would carry, but there'd be a pair of them, be a matched pair. This is a typical pistol of the period. It's got slightly slab-sided, so it could have been a dueling pistol. The ignition system is the simple flintlock system, non-rainproof pan, so it's quite an early one. And it's a very fast action as well. It's got sights on as well, so that makes it more likely to be a target stroke dueling pistol.
The weapon was fired by a flint, striking sparks against a steel frizzen and down into a pan of gunpowder. They could be unreliable and slow to load, but just as deadly as a modern firearm when discharged. Like all flintlocks, dueling pistols were handmade by skilled craftsmen. They could be extremely expensive, desirable objects that were valued as status symbols.
Throughout history, they've been used as a vehicle for artists to express themselves on, and rich patrons have employed the finest artists of the period to actually carry out art on them, engraving, inlay work, the carving on them, particularly the Continentals. The English, much more reserved, very, very fine, very delicate engraving. The Continental stuff was a big example of art being expressed on an object. Whether they're ever used or not is irrelevant. They're an expression of the wealth of the person.
Jonathan Ferguson is curator of firearms at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, UK. Based in the National Firearms Centre, he's carried out research into the Royal Armoury's extensive number of pistols from the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet even in a collection like this, identifying pistols that were made exclusively for duelling is extremely difficult. The Royal Armoury's collection includes different variants of weapons, which show the evolution of the duelling pistol through the Georgian period.
We have around 26,000 firearms in total in the Royal Armoury's collection. Even in a collection of that size, we don't have that many dueling pistols, as sort of evidenced by the way that we look at them today and the way collectors treat them and wish to collect them and look after them, they are sort of almost fetishized as symbols of the duel, of male courage, pride, and also the craftsmanship and skill that it took to make them, and the cost of producing them. So this is the state of play, if you like, coming into sort of 1770. This already has some early features that would assist the duelist if he were to fight a duel with one of these. And as the first recorded pistol duel is something like 1711, this is a dueling pistol in that sense. Could have been used as such. So we have in there a gold pan and a gold touch hole to resist corrosion but also look pretty. We have a very slick flintlock mechanism. The next stage, if you like, if you can view this as a linear evolution, and of course features did overlap, is this kind of thing. Circa 1770, you could call this a transitional type between the holster pistol and the true dueling pistol. Crucially, they started to flatten off the sides of the stock where it's gripped, what we'd call the grip today, which gives a much more secure grip and reduces the lateral drift of the muzzle, if you like, particularly if you're nervous, as you might be if you're putting your life on the line. You see, this is rather more utilitarian in a way. It's lacking the gold or platinum decoration, but it's a beautifully made weapon, and it does, as they say, come up very quickly and smartly and well, and it points as an extension of your arm. You'd probably need a stopwatch to actually time how well a skilled man could bring this onto target. Just bring it up, and the sight picture is right there. You don't have to align it manually. It's just there. This example has sights. They don't always. Some just have a front sight for a quick index. It was actually thought of as bad form to take deliberate aim at your enemy, to even practice beforehand. There are accounts of people being caught practicing before a duel. So you were expected, in a space of 3 seconds was typical, to do what, as I've explained, to bring the thing up very quickly, take your shot, and you know, the devil take the hindmost kind of thing. And this is how we'd expect to encounter a set of dueling pistols on the dueling field, cased. By 1775 or thereabouts, we're seeing some consistent features. The flattened grip panels, almost an afterthought here. And in some cases there is no butt cap. This one has a little silver one there. This is what's called a roller bearing, just like a ball bearing, but it's cylindrical. And it acts on this piece here, which is the steel, or the frizzen in later parlance. And if I close that, and we imagine this firing, and I just throw this open gently with my thumb, it doesn't take that much pressure, and then it flies open. And that just increases the speed of ignition. It allows the sparks struck from this steel to more efficiently communicate that charge, that fire, to the little priming charge that's poured into the pan here ahead of time.
The greatest advancement in firearms technology during the Georgian period was the move from flintlock to percussion ignition.
So here we are with the famous name Manton. You can see right away, just like a modern revolver or other pistol, this grip here is now checkered. There are little remnants of the nice walnut. They wanted to leave those there, clearly. Those also disappear over time. So in essence, this pistol is sort of 1780, something like that. No pommel, no butt cap here at all. It's also something that certainly becomes increasingly popular into the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, is this idea of a half stock. The wood is cut away. And that's partly fashion, but it's partly to accommodate what are now quite heavy barrels. We've gone away from the very quick pistol like the Wogdens to a very thick-walled barrel. And it's octagonal all the way down, as they all are by this stage, pretty much. And in there is Manton's name and his base of operations, London. Many of the famous makers, of course, operating in London. Now, where this is a little bit of a red herring in a way is, as you can see there, this is a percussion hammer that's been fitted here.
The percussion is much more like a modern pistol. It's virtually instantaneous. And I'll do the same demonstration. Bring it to half cock. Percussion cap. Fits on there. The cap is sat onto an anvil, a nipple. When the hammer strikes it, the fulminate of mercury ignites the main charge very, very quickly, and there shouldn't be any delay between that being hit and the smoke comes out the end. Powder out the end, the smoke out the end, almost instantaneously. Much faster ignition system, much more deadly.
Ivan Williams is an artist and designer. Throughout his career, he's combined his skills in fine arts, such as painting and sculpture, with an understanding of practical engineering. This balance of form and function finds its way into his work in commercial design, everything from school furniture to military weapons. Ivan has over half a century's experience in handling firearms, and he has a passion for restoring and shooting period weapons, including dueling pistols.
The thing about these pistols and purpose-made dueling pistols is they point beautifully. I mean, I hold that, it's come up to it, I grip it, if I put my arm out straight to the side, that's dead in line with my eyes. I don't really need to use the sights, and there is only one foresight on there. So in a duel where you need to shoot quickly, it is virtually like pointing your finger.
Richard Hopton has spent years studying duelling in Britain, yet he's never at first hand seen Georgian firearms used. He's joined Ivan Williams for a series of practical range tests to see for himself just how effective they can be in the right hands. Ivan is using original pistols, exactly the type that could have been used to fight duels 2 centuries ago. He's using live ammunition, black powder and a spherical lead bullet almost half an inch in diameter, capable of inflicting hideous wounds on the human body. First, they try the flintlock.
So powder charge, patch, ball, half cock.
And this is the important bit where you're filling up the pan with powder, and this is what will spark against the flint.
It's not easy. The black powder in the exposed pan can easily become damp, making it liable to misfire or not ignite at all.
Well, that must be, the original nightmare. Your gun misfires, you can't reload, and you've just got to wait for the fellow 12 yards away to fire at you. It's quite a big flash, and it's only at your arm's length that this is happening. And then there is a delay between the flash in the pan and the main charge in the breech of the gun going off, which, if you weren't used to it, could be very off-putting, I would think.
Next, Ivan tries the system which superseded the flintlock, the percussion system.
The percussion cap system was much less chancy and worked better,
yes,
certainly in wet weather.
Yes, because the cap fitted over the nipple and it was pretty well weatherproof. It could still absorb moisture. Yeah. And not until it was struck did it ignite, so it was very safe as well.
The percussion system is much more reliable and results in far fewer misfires than the flintlock. A duelist armed with this weapon could be sure his pistol would fire. All he had to do was somehow keep it on target.
With the percussion cap, there is no real delay. The trigger is squeezed and the weapon fires almost instantaneously. I think you got the heart that time, didn't you?
Yes, yes.
I'm very glad I've never fallen out with you, Ivan, over a game of cards or a woman. Right, let's go and have a look at the target, shall we, Ivan?
Yeah.
This is quite a chilling example of, in fact, how accurate these weapons were.
Oh, they were dead accurate. Absolutely dead accurate. If I stand against that target, look at the sort of sideways on, quite a few of those bullets would have been, well, in the neck and heart and lungs.
So, how then do you account for the apparently very large number of duels in which the duelists failed to hit their target at relatively close ranges such as this?
You'd be scared stiff. To have someone thinking someone else was trying to do the same to me, you want to get a shot off quickly, good chance of missing completely.
So it was largely human error rather than some defect in the gun.
So you'd need to be a very particular type of person that could stand there with that much confidence that you were going to win and that the nerves didn't take over.
Former surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on the medical practices of the Georgian period. He's researched the work of medical officers in the Napoleonic Wars, such as George James Guthrie and Sir Charles Bell, and he knows more than most people the effects of black powder firearms.
Well, obviously in a pistol duel, the opponent's very near to you, and therefore the kinetic energy imparted from the black powder discharge and the heavy round ball is going to be pretty high, putting a lot of energy into the body, and then of course it'll tail off as the weight of the ball slows everything down, and it's in a very inefficient shape, unlike modern high velocity rounds which are jacketed and impart huge amounts of energy. But these balls at close range cause very unpleasant injuries. A small entry wound and a lot of disruption as the track of the ball goes through, and if it hits any object, when you're very close to your opponent, it'll even knock pieces of bone out of the back of you, and it'll take force bits of clothing into the wound, which often are in a pretty disgusting state and absolutely florid with bacterial growth, and so huge risk of infection. And obviously it depends where the ball hits you. If it hits you on a fleshy muscle part of your limb, you will be likely to survive with surgery and time, even if infection supervenes. But on the other hand, if you get a ball in the eye or in the jaw or in the neck, it can hit vital structures and cause hemorrhage or paralysis or blindness. And of course in the brain it'll cause fatality almost certainly.
In an era when bacterial infection was not fully understood, some duelists thought that wearing a silk shirt would help protect them if hit. Some even stripped their underwear before a fight.
In the armed services, where obviously small arms fire was constantly destructive and accounted for about 2/3 of most injured men presenting to a surgeon, there are not a few stories of people reducing their clothing or wearing silk clothing in the belief that it protected you in some way, but this was utter rubbish. And in fact, in the Navy particularly, men were always advised to change their underwear and their stockings before battle, because clean clothing would be less likely to cause contamination if it was driven into your body.
Alcoholism was rife in Georgian times. Gentry and commoners alike drank large amounts of strong liquor, and many a duel was fought because of a drunken argument.
Georgian gentlemen drank very heavily. They drank lots of port and wine and so on. Heavy gambling was also a characteristic feature of the Georgian gentlemen, so huge sums of money were wagered, won and lost, and that also presumably shortened tempers and made people more prone to make accusations, which would then lead to a challenge and then to a duel. A large number of dueling stories, for better or worse, involve drink.
The point about alcohol is that it makes you bold as a lion. It's an anxiolytic drug. It reduces your anxiety and fear and gives you more courage, but it's not a painkiller, and it actually decreases performance, and that's why it's dangerous to drink and drive, because your reaction time is slower, and therefore in individual combat you will be less efficient by far if you're under the influence of alcohol.
Many duels were fought early in the morning, after one or both parties had been heavily drinking. After just a few hours, the alcohol would still be at work, and the effects could prove fatal for a duelist.
So here we have a combat between two individuals, and it would very much depend on their alcohol status, whether they had a lot the night before and were still overhung from that, because that will slow down performance. You will obviously find much more efficiency in a man who's been trained in action, who doesn't get in a panic, who hasn't got adrenaline and steroids running through his veins as he points the pistol at somebody else. He may shake. And, you know, with a delay of the flint going off, if he's not used to combat, he may well miss the target, because the kinetic energy is great at short range, but the accuracy is not very good, and so frequently people missed. And most of the shots fired during a pistol duel will hit you in the head, neck, or torso or upper limb, because that's where they're going to be aimed. So I think it very much depends on the two combatants. If they're both professional soldiers and free of alcohol effects, they will be extraordinarily lethal to each other. Whereas if one is feeling the effect of the night before, he will be more nervous, less accurate, and less efficient in his dueling and ability to survive.
Dueling was illegal, so duelists would go for remote or secluded areas to fight their private meetings. Around London in Georgian times, this meant extensive heaths and parks, like Putney Heath and Wimbledon Common, south of the River Thames.
This was undrained, low-lying, low-quality agricultural land, which just happened to be very close to central London and the seat of government. So it was across the river, but more bridges existed then than had done previously. So it was one of the nearest points at which people could relatively safely fight duels, safe from the point of view of discovery or prevention. There were only a small handful of cases in Georgian England where a duelist was convicted of murder by a jury, and they all involved, I think I'm right in saying, instances of foul play at the duel itself. There was a case in Ireland where one duelist simply shot his opponent in the back while the preparations for the duel were still underway, and the jury convicted him of murder and he was hanged. And there were one or two other cases where the duel happened too close to the argument, where seconds weren't involved, quite often where the parties were both drunk. But these were more akin to fights, really, than duels, and so not surprisingly, the juries convicted. But by and large, even where a duelist killed or injured his opponent in a duel, juries were very reluctant indeed to convict. The overall percentage of duelists who ended up in trouble with the law was very small, although some people did feel the need to take themselves temporarily in exile to the continent afterwards to let the brouhaha die down, but that's not quite the same thing. Certainly duelists might lie low afterwards, and publicity was not considered a good thing, which is why so many duels were fought in secret in the early morning in places like Battersea Park, away from the public gaze.
At its height in Georgian times, even Britain's ruling classes found themselves involved in duelling.
Dueling was really confined to a self-defining upper class. It was considered to be something that gentlemen, however that was defined, did. As they used to say, butchers' boys settled their arguments with meaty fists, and and certainly you wouldn't, as a gentleman, you wouldn't consider in those days fighting a duel with someone you considered to be your social inferior. You'd give them a good hiding with a whip, if you felt like it. Gentlemen duelled against gentlemen, and that was the end of it. What underlines The whole ethos of dueling, whether here or in France or in Germany or in South America or in all places at all times, is the idea of the gentleman's honour. It was that forced people to seek redress on the dueling grounds. It was purely the concept of the gentleman's honour, and that was the only way to redress a slight to it.
Politicians, always conscious of their public image, were more open than most to falling into public disagreements. It seems amazing to us now, yet serving British MPs, ministers, and even some prime ministers fought duels. On the 27th of May 1798, at the height of the war between Britain and revolutionary France, Prime Minister William Pitt fought a duel on Putney Common. His opponent was George Tierney, another MP, and it was over a disagreement as to how the war should be fought. Both parties fired and missed, and Pitt resumed office as Prime Minister. Yet King George III was far from happy that he'd nearly lost the head of his government during wartime to a duel.
This is the letter that King George III sent to William Pitt after he, Pitt, had fought his duel as Prime Minister. We shouldn't forget that this was fought, the duel was fought while this country was at war with France. And the king was not very amused by Pitt's activities. And he wrote, very tersely, "Perhaps the duel, could not have been avoided, but it is a sufficient reason to prevent its ever being again necessary." And the king continues, "Public characters have no right to weigh alone what they owe to themselves. They must consider also what is due to their country," which leaves very little doubt as to what King George thought of Pitt putting himself at risk in that fashion.
A few years later, again during wartime, two ministers serving in the same cabinet fought a duel. Secretary for War Viscount Castlereagh and Foreign Secretary George Canning fought on Putney Heath in September 1809.
Well, in the case of Canning and Castlereagh, they both resigned from the cabinet in order to do it. I suppose the fact that they were able to continue in office, having committed what was in effect a criminal offence, and Canning was wounded, is proof, to my way of thinking, of the social acceptability of duelling. I mean, it was what was expected of you.
The most famous of all dueling British politicians fought his encounter on the 21st of March 1829. The Duke of Wellington, hero of the Peninsular War and Waterloo, was the serving Prime Minister. In his time as commander of the army, he had strictly forbidden duelling among his officers. Yet he himself found it impossible to avoid the social pressure of fighting a duel. His opponent was the outspoken Earl Winchelsea, who'd criticised Wellington's opinions on Catholic emancipation.
The contrast between modern Battersea Park and what this part of London would have been like in 1829 is extraordinary, because we have the chimneys and the looming shell of what remains of Battersea Power Station, and the Victorian bandstand and the tennis courts and the joggers and the people walking their dogs. And in 1829 it was low-lying, marshy agricultural land, very far from the plane tree shaded park that it is nowadays. And it's odd to think of a serving Prime Minister, say the David Cameron of his day, trotting out from Westminster on a horse, quite deliberately to shoot at a political opponent. Politicians no longer have anything even approaching the old-fashioned sense of honour. They accuse each other of lying the whole time as a matter of course. They have no sense of public honour at all, and very little sense of shame either, but that's another issue. A small cavalcade came trotting over the bridge and into what is now Battersea Park. And one of the first things they saw when they got here early that morning, they saw an agricultural labourer whetting his scythe, presumably ready to cut the hay or cut the grass in some shape or form. And there were 5 people. There was the Duke of Wellington and his second, who was called Sir Henry Harding, and Winchelsea and his second, who was a man called Lord Falmouth. The fifth member of this cavalcade was a doctor. It was quite common practice to bring doctors to duels in those days for very obvious reasons. But in this particular occasion, the doctor had another and rather unusual function to fulfill. Because Henry Harding, Wellington's second, had lost his left hand at the Battle of Waterloo, he was unable to fulfill one of the second's most important duties, which was to load his principal's gun. And normally this was done by the two seconds supervising each other, and then they would hand the loaded pistols to their principals, and then the distance would be marked out and the duel would then happen. But in this instance, Harding having only one hand, he was unable to load the Duke's pistol for him. So the doctor was drafted in to perform this duty, which one might think was a slightly curious thing for the doctor at a duel to be doing. Once the Duke and Winchelsea had arrived on the dueling ground, the seconds would then have agreed the distance over which it was to be fought, and would most importantly have measured out the distance. They would have been told what signal would be given for fire, and they would then have retired to their respective marks, and then one or other of the seconds shouted fire, or sometimes a handkerchief would be dropped. So it must have been a really frightening prospect, even for someone like Wellington, who had fought in any number of battles from Waterloo and all through the peninsula and in India and so on. And Winchelsea, I don't think, had seen much active service. It must have been really frightening. Once the command to fire was given by one of the seconds, Wellington noticed that Winchelsea was standing with his pistol down by his side, and gradually, slowly he raised it and discharged it into the air, because he decided that he couldn't possibly risk shooting at the Prime Minister, the hero of Waterloo. And at that point, Wellington himself discharged his pistol into the air. So now the duel had happened, honour was satisfied, and an apology was drafted by the seconds, which both Wellington and Winchelsea signed. Wellington tipped his hat to Winchelsea and said, "Good morning, sir," mounted his horse and trotted off. And apparently when he got home, his then mistress, Mrs. Arbuthnot, was having breakfast, and he walked in and said something like, "My dear, what would you think if you heard that a gentleman had been on the dueling ground this morning?" And she said something like, "Oh, I'd be frightfully impressed."
After Wellington, no other British Prime Ministers fought duels. Yet even into the 1840s and beyond, some aristocrats behaved as though it was still the heady days of the Regency, when duelling was at its height. One of the last recorded duels was fought on Wimbledon Common, and it was one of the most talked about ever. Its provoker was one of the most controversial characters of the whole Victorian period.
It's here on Wimbledon Common that Lord Cardigan in September 1840 fought his celebrated duel against Captain Tuckett. Cardigan and Tuckett had fallen out over various things to do in Cardigan's regiment, the 11th Hussars, and Tuckett published an anonymous but defamatory article about Cardigan in the press, and Cardigan had a fairly shrewd idea who was responsible. He demanded an apology and then challenged him to a duel. So it was on the 12th of September 1840 that Cardigan and Captain Tuckett came here to fight their duel near the famous windmill. Tuckett was wounded, and the miller, one Thomas Dan, who also doubled as the local constable, saw Cardigan classically with the smoking pistol in his hand and ran down from the windmill to make an arrest. And that's how the matter ended up in the law courts, as it did 3 or 4 months later. The Cardigan duel was not the last duel in England, but certainly the last notorious duel, because Cardigan, being a peer, exercised his right to be tried for the wounding of Captain Tuckett by his peers. So there was a great set-piece trial in the House of Lords in February 1841, which attracted huge attention. Tickets for seats in the chamber were sold, and the press whipped up a huge amount of enthusiasm about it. And Cardigan was acquitted on a gross technicality, which led to an enormous amount of anger and frustration in the newspapers, because Cardigan was not a popular man. He was very wealthy and sort of rather behaved like a Regency buck 30 years too late.
Lord Cardigan would, 15 years later, lead the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. Never popular with his soldiers, nor with the public, Cardigan was notoriously arrogant and quarrelsome. Just a few years after Cardigan's duel, the Queen's regulations were changed to stamp out duelling among officers in the army. With that, duelling gradually fell away.
By the end of the 19th century, duelling was absolutely dead in England, and there are one or two well-known cases, the best known of which is called the Tranby-Croft affair, which was 1891, I think, when exactly the same sort of people who a generation or two earlier would have been fighting a duel over an accusation of cheating at cards, ending up suing each other for defamation. You know, they were rich, they were army officers, exactly the types who would have been fighting duels, 40 years before. And they ended up in the law courts in the 1890s. The possibility of seeking redress through the courts, either in the law of defamation or however else, became more socially acceptable and a better remedy.
As the 19th century moved on into the reign of Queen Victoria, standards changed, and duelling was no longer viewed as an acceptable way of settling disputes. Yet things turned full circle when the art of duelling could be tried out without risk of a fatal bullet wound.
The ultimate expression of this reduction in tolerance for violence and in the reduced casualty rate that you get with firearms, perversely, is this piece here that we have in front of us. The pistols are quite real, but it's designed to fire little compressed wax bullets. These are for simulating a duel or simply for fun, for sport. These are a mixture of charcoal, powder and wax. They're very light. They could potentially be lethal if they hit you in the wrong place, but you were intended to wear a very thick, full-length coat and a sort of Edwardian paintball mask, if you like, to protect your eyes and face. And apart from some boxes of ammunition that you can see here, bullet mold, cleaning tools, most interestingly of all is this heart-shaped steel guard. And we're then ready to aim and fire with our hand protected thoroughly by this substantial piece of steel. They are breech loading. This is the 20th century after all. This lever on the side here opens the breech, and a little extractor removes one of these, which is essentially like the rim of a cartridge to hold the primer. That's the propellant. No more loading it from the muzzle, pushes the wax bullet out of the front of the gun. So this on its own could potentially be lethal, but it's the bullet that makes it a game.
With the end of the 1850s, pistol duelling in Britain had almost completely disappeared. It represented a bygone era, kept alive only in the works of painters, novelists and dramatists.
I suppose on the face of it, it's romantic. In practice, I suspect it was very unromantic, terrifying. There's something very sort of cold and clinical and calculating about having an argument and then challenging someone to a duel, then the seconds trying to resolve it, and then when they can't resolve it, deciding on which weapons to be used, where they should meet, the time of day and all that sort of thing. And then the duelist getting into his carriage and going there, having spent the night very often writing letters to his nearest and dearest and settling his affairs, thinking that he might be dead by breakfast time.